Thank you for the intro, Tani. Well, hi everyone. Welcome to our session. As Tani mentioned, my name is Helena. I am an art director and a creative technologist. I work at Buck in New York alongside a very talented team of artists and designers who bring spatial experiences to life.
And I'm Alexis, Zerafa. I currently sit on the experience team at The Mill, and I help with our AR activations.
Cool, it works, great. So Alexis and I have worked with AR as one of our primary mediums for a number of years now, with our respective companies as well as independently. And as people who are creatively inclined, with Alexis having her own multi-hyphenate creative practice and me coming from a background in design, we often think about the role that aesthetics plays in the creation of AR experiences. For us, aesthetic impact is about how something looks and how it makes people feel. That is the focus for today's session. Because when it comes to creating experiences with AR, it's not just about building out the logic or demonstrating the technical marvels. We might get really excited about that, but not so much to the audience. So if we want to be able to influence people's perceptions and to really craft moments that feel memorable, then we have to embrace the process of visual design and consider the tone and voice of what we're making. We believe that the way something looks is a really powerful way to establish an identity, to communicate your values as a creator and also the values of the brand that you're working for, to evoke emotional responses from the audience, to induce memorability, to reflect certain cultural and societal influences, and most importantly, to invite wonder and imagination. We also recognize that the topic of aesthetics is pretty broad and it's highly subjective, and it's going to warrant a much deeper dive into the principles of design and visual perception. So our goal for the next 20 minutes is to talk through some of the aesthetic considerations that are relevant to AR. We're going to start with a strategic lens on design, looking at how we can approach AR experiences with a sense of cohesion. Then we'll move on to the tactical portion, which Alexis will take us through, with techniques and practical frameworks that can be used to enhance the visual fidelity of real-time experiences. So starting with the strategic, design bridges the gap between the code and the audience. It's how we come up with the most effective and most appropriate ways to package and to present an idea. But to do it well, we have to be thoughtful about it. Just like with any new projects, we have to first ask some questions to set ourselves on the right track rather than just jumping in without a clear understanding or an objective insight. And I want to preface by saying that aesthetics is a matter of taste and preferences, so there are no inherently right or wrong ways to go about it. But what often sets good design apart from the rest is this emphasis on cohesion, having cohesion in vision and purpose, which then will propagate to design. That's what we're trying to do here by asking these questions first. So here are some examples of questions that you might want to ask when you start a new AR project. What is the intended purpose of the experience? What is the point of this thing that we're making? What emotions are we trying to evoke out of the audience? Who even is the target audience? Who's most likely to participate? What is this journey that we want to take the audience through? Are there existing design guidelines or references that we can lean into? Because chances are if you're working on a project with a brand, they probably have design guidelines, so ask for them. Are there external influences that may affect our decisions? For example, will there be different stakeholders with different agendas that may influence how we make decisions? What are some of the key themes? And what are some of the possibilities that are only afforded by AR in this scenario? And the scale, what's the scale of the experience? Are we talking about a singular object, or is this experience going to go beyond room scale? And is it a standalone experience, or is it part of a much larger universe? Now, these questions may seem rudimentary, but they're quite easy to overlook. You do need to answer these questions, or at least have a strong internal understanding of what it is that you're striving for in order to then shape the creative direction. And this is especially important for commercial projects where you have multiple stakeholders with different point of views. Alexis and I have both lived through this at our respective agencies. Someone somewhere might decide to join a call and give a bunch of creative feedback that conflicts with the overall aesthetics. But if you know what it is that you're aiming for, and if you can speak to why you've made certain design choices, then you can effectively manage stakeholders' expectations and push back against any notes that are potentially misaligned with the experience. And essentially, what we're trying to do here is to lay out a blueprint for design so that we can allow our creative tendencies or epiphanies to be guided by intention and purpose. So now, what are the building blocks? At this point, we have somewhat of a blueprint for design, but what aspects of the AR experience can we infuse our design sensibilities into? The short and the cop-out answer is pretty much everything, because the way something looks and feels is going to draw from a multitude of variables. As we know, augmented reality is about how things look in context, not in isolation. So the way something appears to an audience is going to directly relate to the space in which it's meant to be experienced, the brand image that it's associated with, and also the interactions that it calls for. And so aesthetic considerations are going to be in constant dialogue with other facets of development. This is by no means a comprehensive diagram, but we can start to identify these aesthetic variables by the categories. For example, we have design essentials, we have spatial elements, we have magic, information, and also sensorial and dimensional. So looking at design essentials, these refer to elements such as color, texture, material, shape, form, pattern, composition, hierarchy, and scale. Pretty standard stuff. That's because these are universal foundational pieces for visual design, and these should be the first category of variables that any designer familiarizes themselves with. Oh, sorry, I didn't change the slide. So then looking at spatial elements, now these are elements that are made possible through three-dimensional existence, and these are the ones that we have to pay close attention to for AR experiences. And these refer to elements such as world context, atmosphere, how are we going to build atmosphere? What about the sense of depth, perspective with layering? How are things going to move? What is the relationship between objects? What is the relationship between an object and an audience? What about the camera angles? So spatial elements go a step beyond the essentials by looking at how these foundational pieces fit together and how they relate to each other when they're situated in a three-dimensional environment. Then we have information. So depending on the platform you build on, some of the way that interfaces are displayed is going to be standardized. But if it's going to be custom, the way we convey information will have to be considered for. And so everything you design still needs to feel aligned with the experience and be part of that world. And that involves interface, navigation, instructions, graphic coaching overlays, and also typography. And then we have magic. It's one of my favorite categories, and I call it magic. It's because this involves all those extra little details that add delight and flavors to an experience. We're now looking at animation, transitions, interactivity, feedback indicators, and how we play with light shadows. I also include a sensorial and dimensional here because visual design can also be combined with other elements such as sound effects or haptics, or be influenced by the progression of time to add depth to the way people engage with it. So now we have the conceptual blueprint and some of an understanding of what these building blocks are. And now we can start thinking about the art direction. What is the art direction meant to be, and what is it not meant to be? One approach that I found helpful over the years is the use of spectrums. So when we create spectrums with visual references, this helps us identify the Goldilocks zone. So we will set up two extremes along the spectrum, and we can mark out roughly where our experience sits. And it doesn't have to be in the middle, but it's somewhere along this line. And this approach not only helps designers anchor the art direction, it can also be an effective tool for communicating that direction with the rest of the team as well as stakeholders. So we can look at some examples together. We're going to start with tone. So the tone of an experience has direct influence over its style. Are we aiming for hyper-realism, or can we take creative liberties with style? So a realistic tone, like the Nike 50th anniversary example, is going to feel more formal because it depicts things as they are, and it's usually called upon for context where accuracy is important. So When you have to display historic artifacts, you probably want to go for the realistic one. On the other hand, a highly stylized tone is going to emphasize expression and playfulness. It helps with convey concepts more vividly and is a really great way to cement a personal style. I'm so sorry, I keep forgetting to press this. Okay, so second example is scale. What is the scale of the experience? If we're aiming for an installation that's expansive and exists in a public space, then the design of it has to be visually impactful from a distance. And you would probably want to lean into bold silhouettes or vivid colors to help capture people's attention. But then for something that exists on more of a personal scale that uses something like phase or body tracking, it's much more of a close-up experience, and so the design should reflect that sense of personal connection through textures that are more detailed or having responsive elements that can be tailored to the individual. Interactivity also plays a part in visual aesthetics. So for an experience that calls for active interactions, such as the Dior stars example, you're waving your hand, you're tapping the screen, so you're going to have to design feedback indicators, such as visual, auditory, or haptic responses that guide users, confirm their actions, and progress the journey. Whereas for something passive, like the Coachella example, that facilitates more of an observational experience. It becomes more about looking around and feeling immersed. And so there could be a greater focus on making sure that the AR elements are sequenced out in a way that's intuitive to follow. For movement, here we have keyframed versus procedural. A procedural approach allows for more dynamic and organic animations. So if we're going down that route, then the AR elements should be designed in a way that's flexible and fluid so that they're able to adapt in real time to external influences. Whereas keyframe movements imply something that feels more controlled and deliberate, and allows us to both dramatize the movements or keep things consistent. So timing and stylization will be crucial factors to consider for this one. Also, what is the context? Are we designing a singular emblematic object that appears in front of you, or is it an experience that integrates with the physical space and fully surrounds you? Looking at the Fendi example, for a single object that stands alone, the design of it has to serve as a focal point. It probably will also have to carry certain thematic significance that allows the object to make a statement. Whereas for an integrated experience like the Atelier of Dreams for Dior, the focus then shifts to how the design would blend into the environment, how it can enhance the overall ambience. It's about how things can collectively contribute to a space rather than dominating it. We can also think about macro interactions. So if a person's going to move through this space and there are objects surrounding them, how could that movement, how could that flow through this room potentially affect the look of things? So this design distinction will drastically impact the end experience. And here's an example of how you might mark the direction across different categories for your AR project. And then as you proceed with design, all of the creative decisions you make should relate back to what you've established. So earlier I mentioned that there are no right or wrong approaches to aesthetics as long as everything feels cohesive, and that still stands true. That's why we use spectrums, that's why we use annotated references to help us maintain that sense of cohesion through the design process. However, if spectrums are not your thing, or if breaking down design elements feels too granular to start, then simply start with the broad stroke. Don't get fixated on the small art direction details just yet. When you think about the experience that you're creating, what is that one sweeping gesture you want to convey? If you're going to say one thing and one thing only, what is that? You can start there, then consider whether or not the rest of your design choices align with that gesture. Another consideration that allows us to create more visual impact is dynamism. Make things come alive. Honestly, one of the most compelling aspects of AR is the ability to render dynamic content. And the look of virtual objects can practically be influenced by a whole array of factors. And I'm not talking about just using our fingers to tap or slide across the screen, but we can look at subtle parameters such as proximity, gaze, time, location, even light levels. And any changes in appearance through these subtle parameters will help with facilitating that sense of discovery and spontaneity. And then transition with purpose. How do things move from one to another? How will one state switch to the next? Pacing and transitions are such an essential part of any experience that involves motion. And there are far more graceful ways for AR content to enter and exit a scene than just having a simple visibility toggle. Even just a simple opacity fade would feel so much more considered than having objects diagonally popping in and out. So next time you design transitions, think about how you could design them in a way that ties in with the rest of the visuals or even serving as a narrative vehicle. Lastly, leverage physical space and consider how the AR content integrates with the environment. One way to go about it is to harness details from the real environment that will enable the AR experience to complement it. If you're looking at a site-specific activation, then try drawing inspiration from the space in which the AR will be situated, such as looking at the materials of the location, infusing those materials into your experience, or borrowing from certain architectural features. Ultimately, this is about allowing the virtual and the tangible to work together to form a cohesive whole. And on that note, I shall pass it to Alexis.
Thank you, Helena. You gotta excuse me, both of my feet fell asleep. All right, so how do we execute all of that now? And how does optimization play into artfulness? Creating anything is a game of give and take. There's always gonna be compromises to be made and pivots to take. I like to think of it as like floating down a little pond on a lily pad. Sometimes you bounce the wrong way off of things, and sometimes you're on the wrong slide. There we go. But usually you end up where you need to be. The constraints of your final deployment platform can actually be used to provide structure to how you build your ideas and ideate, instead of just being a limiting factor. And why are we talking about optimization at all? Because it plays heavily into usability, and ultimately, usable and smooth experiences are just better for the overall end user and audience. So I was talking to a coworker on our CG team. They make very large assets, and I was lamenting about our 3D pipeline for social AR and how we're very limited with file size, but he actually likened it to building a ship in a bottle, which is a bit of a tedious activity, but ultimately enjoyable, and I thought that was a really sweet comparison. So starting from the top, and with the most obvious, the way to make a performant experience is to choose performant assets when possible. Each experience is obviously different and will call for a different set of ingredients, so to say. So there's not one right way to do something, but there are some guiding factors that you can use. For example, utilizing like procedural shaders when you need something that's infinitely scalable, using vertex displacement when you can instead of adding a heavy rig. You can use SDFs for transparency and for lots of other cool things like collision detection that are beyond me. And then things like level of detail systems, where it's a multifaceted object that has different types of geometry depending on how far or close the user is to the camera. For me, the 3 tiers of optimization fall under consolidation, prioritization, and stylization. Not necessarily in that order, kind of like all at the same time. So I'll use these as a guide to show you how to edit an experience into something that's ultimately more enjoyable for the user. There are different ways to consolidate and make space to fit more into what you create. So here's a few tactics you could use that really help. You can bake down textures to consolidate texture data that goes into an object. You can do this with normal maps and lighting and so much more. Texture atlases are also like a little map for all your textures, so that's a great way to reduce draw calls and make something more performant. And then when speaking to AR, like Helena mentioned, you can allow the environment to play a larger character role as well. So less is more in that regard. Here's an example of baking down a normal map, so you can use super low poly assets that still look high fidelity. And then texture atlases, the left is in empanadas, but there's a plate and the sour cream is there and the chips, and then you can go really crazy and have like a whole village in one texture map. Texture atlas. And then with every project obviously comes compromise, right? Very rarely will you be able to put, everyone's brainstorm or ideation session into one experience. So prioritizing what key hero elements you have can help you design in turn like how to make those assets. Like I said with the texture atlases, you can have those hero elements be a little bit larger so they're higher fidelity. You can also think about the deployment platform from the very start. So assets that will appear smaller or on mobile can be a lot lower fidelity, lower quality. And then keeping in mind what elements are static, what will the user interact with? Do you really need the underside of that rock or toaster if they're never gonna see it? So cutting down is also a nice way to edit. And then with the same principles as prioritization, we want to play with stylization as well. So for example, if your release platform is social AR and you only have 4 megabytes total, but you want a ton of elements, maybe going for something purposefully low poly from the beginning is a good way to pitch that idea. Or if you're making a target tracked experience, I think it's best to let the target shine through. That way, if there's some misalignment on the user's end, they might not notice. So you want to adorn rather than cover. Same thing with transparency in assets. Instead of using PNGs, you could be creative with blend modes or use alpha maps instead. Ultimately, what I've found is if something really can't be made to look good in a scene within the given context, putting some sparkles or some glow over it really works wonders. I do that every time. So overall, generally, you want to create things that are easy to use and robust. But how do you do that? So thinking about the entire journey from end to end, from the very beginning of when you start conception, is super important. So you can start with your audience. This is a good way to determine the release platform as well. What's their general demographic? What are their interests? How will they interact with your specific topic matter? And how tech savvy are they? Do they know how to use a QR code, for example? Sometimes people don't. And then, where will people experience this? Is it target tracked or image tracked, so it's based in one area? Are people going to stub their toes while using your experience? Is it dark? Is it light? There's lots of factors that play into environment, so letting that guide creation is super important as well. And then the user flow, from the beginning to the end of the journey, making sure you think about that whole cycle from the very beginning will help you when you're creating and when you're budgeting out assets. What's important? Sometimes things like print materials need to be thought of ahead of time, even though that's something that might not feel as important, because that is the entryway to the experience, right? So we need to prioritize almost everything. And then as Helena mentioned, it's important to keep in mind more aspects than just visual elements of a work from the very beginning. If you make space for these things like sound, smell, and touch, ultimately you're going to create something that's more accessible and that more people can enjoy. And then lastly, but obviously not least, ultimately, what are you giving to the audience? Is it a coupon for Doritos or something less concrete but just as impactful, like a fleeting feeling of happiness or curiosity? Determining that end intention and letting it guide you through your creation process is extremely important and very good as like a guiding light moment. And if we have like 2 minutes, so if anyone has any questions, you can ask us questions. If not, that's good, then we can leave. She's got one in the back.
Hi, I'm just curious of what platform you're using to create your AR experiences in. Is it Unity? Do you have plugins? What are you using to put it all together?
So the majority of experiences shown in this slide were made using Metaspark.
Yeah, a mix of like social AR platforms, so Metaspark, Lens Studio, TikTok. We do some immersive and in-headset experiences, but those tend to be more NDA, less slide decky, but typically that's the way to reach broader audiences when you're making something shareable and you want user-generated content.
1 minute left.
Ask your questions really fast.
Oh, okay. 1 minute.
Great. Hello.
Hi, Alex.
Hi. So you mentioned sparkles, adding a lot of razzle-dazzle.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to hear both of your simple, easy ways to add a lot of spice at the end.
Yeah, if you have some ugly transitions, just adding something that has a little reflectivity and then blurring in the 2 directions so it makes like that little sparkle, right? So it obscures maybe some weird shape-shifting that's happening. That's a good go-to.
I second that. The interstellar dust you saw from the Coachella example, that was actually achieved through blurring. So using a combination of a Fresnel shader, using the Fresnel shader then as a mask to apply blurring to make certain things look like it's floating in space.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.